My name is Jessica Derutza from Trust Psyche, and it is such a pleasure and a great honor for us to get to spend this Sunday with all of you here on June 2nd, 2019. Trust Psyche offers these monthly live streams on the first Sunday of every month at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. To interact live and to ask questions and make comments, you can join us at trustpsyche.com/livestream. We would also love for all of you to follow us on social media. We have a Trust Psyche YouTube channel, a Facebook group and page. Our Instagram is Trust Psyche Astrology. You can follow us on Twitter and Pinterest. And we'd also love for you to join us on our monthly podcasts, which are separate than these live streams. That podcast is called Stream, and it covers everything astrological and psychological, and you can find that on Spotify, iTunes, Google Play, and Podbean. So I am very excited for our talk today by my husband, Travis Derutza, on the transformations of time. As astrologers, we both study and interpret the nature of time and the evolving or changing quality of time through the movement of the planets. Today, we have the great pleasure of receiving the insights and wisdom and compassion of Travis. Travis is a beautiful and unique combination of mind and heart, with his Mercury in Gemini at the midheaven, conjunct Venus in Taurus, all in the ninth house, so having to do with philosophy, religion, spirituality. And that Mercury-Venus conjunction of the heart and the mind is opposite Uranus. So there's a lot of brilliance and insight there, and eccentricity, thinking outside the box, but also, of course, astrology. Travis has carried two strong currents throughout his entire life, that of philosophy and literature and being a professional musician. Again, bringing together Venus of Eros and Mercury Logos. Travis did his undergraduate at Columbia in literature and music, and then he went on to travel Europe and Asia, playing his upright bass for a decade. Can you imagine, for all of those who've traveled the world, carrying that huge instrument with you everywhere you go? And just to imagine the level of devotion and really devotion to creative play that would have to be there in someone to carry that instrument on trains, planes, and automobiles. Travis then came back to the States and did his master's degree in philosophy, cosmology, and consciousness at the California Institute of Integral Studies, where we met in San Francisco. And then now he's currently in the final months of finishing his dissertation and receiving his PhD in philosophy and religion, where his focus is on participation. And we're going to hear about some of that today. I hope all of you can receive the nurturance and guidance that Travis brings with his sun and moon in Cancer. And I'm also very excited that Travis will be teaching early next year in 2020 after he finishes his PhD. He'll be teaching an archetypal approach to the signs and houses. So for all of you astrologers and lovers of astrology out there who've been wanting to focus on the signs and houses and expand your archetypal astrological practice, this course will definitely be for you in doing that archetypal approach to the signs and the houses. So please help me welcome Travis Derutza on the transformations of time. Travis will speak for approximately 45 minutes, and then he'll open the floor for questions and comments. And at that time, I'll explain how you can go ahead and raise your hand and share if you would like to do so. Travis, it's all you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. It's lovely to see all your beautiful faces. So today, I want to take us on a journey through time, a journey through history, and a rumination on what it means for each of us to be ceaselessly flowing forward through time on the waves of this cosmic adventure. How do we respond to this world that we're thrown into, that we wake up in? And how do we become responsible to ourselves, and to those around us. So I'd like you to ask me to join me while we ground in here. This burning sage represents the irreversible direction of time. With each moment that passes, ashes are created that linger as traces of what's gone by, while each moment burns bright in anticipation of what's to come, with the future always flowing forward until that final passing over into the great beyond. I'd like you to close your eyes or soften your gaze and to sit with me while I read you this poem, an invocation of the transformations of time. Steady Now by Eamon Grennan. Although things vanish, are what mark our vanishing, we still hold on to them, ballast against the updraft of oblivion, as I hold on to this umbrella in a world of rain, of heavy wet greens and grays dissolving into a new atmosphere, a sort of underwater dulled electric glow off everything, the air itself drowning in it, breath thickening, growing mold. Yesterday I felt the smell of grass greeting me as across a great distance, trying to tell me some good thing in an underglaze of memory, some forgotten summer trying to speak its peace. It is the way of things, and it never stops, never calls a halt. This knocking and dismantling, this uprooting, cutting out and digging down, so tall oaks and honey locusts are laid low and dropped to earth like felled cattle, shaking the ground we've taken a stand on as if it were a steady establishment, a rock of ages to outface ruin itself, not the provisional, slippery, dissolving, dissolute thing it is, which we have, against all the evidence, set our hearts on. When you're ready, open your eyes and come back. Eamon Grennan writes about the passage of time. He writes about how things vanish and die, and about the personal and emotional commitments we make despite, or maybe even because of this transience. What does it mean to live in a time-directional world? A world that never turns back, never stops, never calls a halt. How do we respond to it, and what are our responsibilities? So last month, Jessica gave a talk at the New Moon in Taurus about the Great Reckoning and some of the embodied and tangible consequences of our actions. And today, at the New Moon in Gemini, I'd like to think a little bit more about consequences through time, about the unfolding of our life stories. The twins of Gemini invite us to think the moment upon moment way that time passes, each instant nearly identical to the one before it, and yet different enough to contain all of this wide-ranging world, our colored histories. So what is time? Just take a moment, reflect on it. What is time? It's the kind of word that we throw around casually as if everybody knows what it means. And as long as nobody asks me what it means, I'm pretty sure I know. But as soon as I try to explain it to someone who asks, I'm not really so sure. So stop for a moment and try to just let the strangeness of time sink in as it transpires all about us. So this talk is called Transformations of Time. Under our current Saturn-Pluto conjunction, we honor time, Saturn, and transformation, Pluto. And this title has a double sense. On the one hand, it means how time itself transforms, the historical evolution of our philosophical understanding of time through its many different permutations. And on the other hand, it means how time causes transformation, how we're affected and transformed by time, through time. And this double sense is akin to how we understand an archetypal pair functioning as a sort of two-way street. So Saturn acts through Pluto, time itself transforms, and Pluto acts through Saturn, the transformations brought about by time. So what we're going to be doing today, we could call philosophy of astrology or metaphysics of astrology. And we're going to examine the basic underlying assumptions of some of our astrology, our beliefs about the mechanisms of action of the cosmos, the workings behind the workings of the world. So for example, whether we believe in a fatalistic or a free will astrology is going to entail certain premises about how the universe operates and how time unfolds. But we're also going to be examining applications of these beliefs, both in terms of our astrological technique, how changes in our metaphysics can change how we practice, but also in terms of our life, how changes in our metaphysics can change our approach to how we live. I'm trained in philosophy, so I'm going to mention some philosophers' names along the way, not because you're supposed to know them or you're supposed to care, but just as signposts in case you do know them or you'd care to. So during the first part of the talk, I'll consider several theories of time and what sort of astrology might emerge from each set of ideas. And then in the second part, I want to look more closely at the role of storytelling or narrative as our lives unfold in time. The narrative of our unique life has everything to do with the story of our transformation. So in the first part, we'll consider ideas about time, Saturn, and then in the second part, how we move through time, narrative, and transformation, Pluto. So depending on your understanding and interpretation of what time is, or what's going on with time, you get a different view of astrology and how it works. So let's start with two examples that we could roughly call objective time and subjective time. Aristotle and Plato represent the first, and Kant is a representative of the second. We'll take a look at the view of time, and then we'll think about what sort of astrology might emerge from it. So the oldest and most traditional view of time sees it as an objective cosmological framework in which events unfold. It's a form through which content passes. Time is an ordering of change. It's a way that we keep track or keep account for what's come before and what's come after. The now is the most real, with the past and the future being variations of the now moment. They're nows that have not yet come, or nows that have gone by. But theoretically, all these moments can be made present. All moments will be, or were once, a now moment. And in that sense, they're all equal to one another. So time is this perpetual succession of snapshot now moments, with each one able to be isolated. And in this sense, time is synchronic or synchronized. Each moment is locked in with itself and discrete from all the other moments. So some thinkers would call this a spatialized time, or conceiving time in terms of space or on the model of space. And this is what a timeline kind of does. A line is something spatial that we're using to represent time. So as time passes, it's as if I'm running my finger along a timeline, and any single moment corresponds to a point on the line. Time is this linear order in which objects appear and events take place. Now, if we were to take all these moments together at once, we might have eternity, all time. Plato calls time the moving image of eternity. Time is the moving image of eternity. So it's as if eternity is being parceled out to us moment by moment. The fixed stars are the best image of this eternity, and the planetary wanderers, planet means wanderer in Greek, they move against this background. So the planets moving against the encasing heavens and this movie that is our life are simply enactments of a fixed, motionless, permanent reality, eternity. The movie seems to be ongoing, but in fact, the script is pre-written, and for the director, there aren't any surprises. So such an objective view of time naturally is going to lead to a fatalistic astrology. The planets sweep out our destinies like a giant pre-programmed clock. So objective time as a metaphysical category is a kind of degraded version of eternity. Eternity is playing itself out in time, and we're just players on the stage, locked into our script. This is the objective view of time. Now, if we want to imagine the polar opposite of this, we could consider an extreme view of subjective time, in which time is imposed on reality by the subject. This is what Kant suggested. So here, time's a kind of device that our minds use to structure and order reality. It's as if we're encountering something that's so complex and intricate that we need to see pieces of it over time just to make sense of it. So in this way, Kant's version is really not so different than Plato's moving image of eternity, but instead of eternity, time's the moving image of a reality before me that's just so complex that I can't grok it all at once. Time's still a form that allows us to organize any possible experience as content. It functions as a condition under which sensations or thoughts emerge and can have meaning. Time's a condition for the possibility of experience. So in this case, I can never really get out of my own head because my head conditions how I see all of reality. The structures of the cosmos are in fact just a reflection of the structures of my own psyche. It's as if I'm in the matrix, really, and the entire structure of the matrix is simply the structure of my own mind. So the astrology that might come out of this would suggest that even the apparent movement of the planets is created by my psyche, with my mind constructing the movement of the planets in step with my own life drama. So Aristotle and Kant, despite their differences, both conceive time as a neutral order in which something cosmic and objective or something private and subjective unfolds. Also in both cases, time's conceived as synchronized, as a series of discrete and isolated snapshot moments. So neither scheme really provides for free will in the sense that we're used to. The objective one lacks it altogether, this kind of clockwork destiny machine, while the subjective one is will altogether. It's all me, but it's will inside a self-enclosed bubble, and it doesn't give will anything to act on, so it really sort of undercuts the notion of free will. So neither the Aristotelian objective time nor the Kantian subjective time provides a satisfying account of temporality that could support our modern astrology. If we don't want our sense of freedom to be an illusion, we're going to need something else. So most contemporary astrologies fall somewhere in between, incorporating a component of free will, but also ascribing an objective meaning to the encasing framework of time and the planets. How do we marry these two components, and how do they interact with one another? So these are some questions that we'll explore throughout and that we'll return to at the end of the talk. So first, let's consider another view of time that makes a space for free will. Henri Bergson rejects these two models and tries to develop a theory of time that can accommodate free will. He calls his idea of time duration, and he focuses on our felt experience of time. So what retrospectively we can understand as discrete moments are first experienced as a flux, as events in a kind of process of becoming, flowing by. And really, as soon as we try to measure a moment, it's gone. While we can measure something motionless, like a complete line, time's always in motion and time's always incomplete. For a person who's experiencing it, time can speed up or slow down, whereas for science, it always stays the same. For example, when I'm hungry for my pizza, it seems like it takes forever for the oven to preheat, and yet that same 15 minutes just zips by when I'm eating the pizza. So the passage of time, in this sense, is fluid. This also points to the role of the anticipation of the future in the present. I can't isolate the moment that I wait for my pizza from its context. Everything about that moment of waiting is defined by what's to come. So in this sense, the future coexists with the present, shaping it, defining it. Likewise, the past, as memory, is constantly informing the present, allowing me to remember how to do things like turn on the oven. But more than that, it's our past memories and it's our future projects that give our life meaning in the present. Each moment is heavy with the past, pregnant with the future. Moments aren't discrete snapshots, but they're part of an unbroken continuum of duration. So let's try to demonstrate this. I'm going to ring this bell, and I want you to try to notice the exact moment it starts and the exact moment it stops, as well as the changing volume in between. Now notice how your ability to say when the bell starts and stops crucially depends on the moments that come before and after. You wouldn't be able to say that the bell had started without perceiving that it hadn't yet started a moment before. And just the same, you wouldn't be able to say that it had stopped without perceiving that it had just been ringing a moment before. Likewise, perceiving a change of volume is only possible in relation to the surrounding moments. So what we perceive is flowing change, not individual moments. The past and the future are implicated in every second of the present. So we have this unbroken continuum of duration. But moment to moment, things are constantly changing. Yet these changes are interpenetrating with one another and can't really be isolated. They can't be extracted from the whole of which they're a part. So here's another illustration. This magic moment when your lips are close to mine. So notice already how when I stop that melody mid-phrase, you're probably already anticipating its future completion in the present. You're anticipating the rest of the melody. And if you're doing so, it's only because your past memory of the melody allows you to. But the other point I want to make here is that none of the notes that I just sang really has meaning apart from the other ones. La da da dee da 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 da. So see, I began and ended on the same note, but they have a very different quality because of what's come in between, this inverted arc. And so none of the notes' meaning is isolatable. The arc of the melody only makes sense as a whole, and it loses its meaning when it's subdivided into individual notes. So past, present, and future, all in some sense, coexist in the present. All three dimensions of time are woven together and co-implicated with one another, and we can't really divide them up without losing the meaning of the whole. So Kant has confused time with its spatial representation, turning something moving and fluid into something motionless and fixed. Because it's fluid, duration can't be grasped by fixed concepts. So take the analogy of a city. Even if we have 1 million still snapshots of every single possible point of view of the city, you still won't understand the direct, thick, dimensional experience of a waking, living city itself. Time as duration is the same. It can't be understood through a frozen analysis, but only through first-person experience. And the same goes for motion. So maybe you've heard of Zeno's paradox. Zeno thought that motion was impossible because any point could be infinitely divided, and it was impossible to cross an infinite space. So this is usually illustrated by someone trying to walk across half the room, and then half the remaining distance, and then half again, and so on forever, never reaching the other side. But in light of duration, this is to mistake motion and time for fixed things when in fact they're dynamic processes, they're progressions. So it's only retrospectively that we can treat them spatially and divide them up, when in fact they're an indivisible whole. I can refute Zeno's paradox by simply standing up and walking across the room, getting to the other side. This is the first-person experience rather than the frozen analysis. So duration's pure change with no timeline underneath it and no time container around it. Time's not some degraded version of eternity, but just its own thick and flowing whole. And existing is participating in this ongoing fluidity. What Aristotle and Kant saw as the impossibility of free will was an illusion that was created by their frozen analysis of time. I refute Zeno by walking across the room. It's not that I operate within time, rather time just is these ongoing operations of change. So seeing my own freedom in this evolving movement of duration is a solution to the fatalistic astrology that emerged from the earlier models. We're not pawns of an objective cosmological time that contains us, nor of a subjective private time that isolates us in our own head. Duration is just this ongoing flow in which we participate. So this view of time supports a more humanistic or human-centered astrology in which free will is a vital and necessary component. So now I want to talk a little bit about how this idea of duration can apply to astrological practice. So first, I think that this thickening of the present moment to include the past and the future supports the wider orbs that we use in archetypal astrology. I think that the fixation on the exact 0-degree conjunction, the perfection, is a bit like treating time as these discrete, isolated snapshot moments. Because once we think through the fact that time doesn't work this way, our astrology should really follow suit. So here are the orbs that we use in archetypal astrology. So I see folks say on Facebook all the time that these orbs are way too large, and yet they're often the same people that are drawn to the work of Rick Tarnas. And so I ask the question, why embrace archetypal astrology but not use the orbs? Second, I think this view of time also supports contextualizing the natal chart within the world transits of the time, which have even larger orbs than the natal chart. Here are the orbs of world transits that we use. So I'll just show two quick examples on either side of the Uranus-Neptune conjunction of the 90s to illustrate a bit what I'm saying. This is Jessica DeRutz's natal chart, my lovely wife. She was born in '87 on the front end of the Uranus-Neptune conjunction. So judging from her character, I don't think anyone would contest that she carries the Uranus-Neptune energy, liberating and championing our spirituality, unlocking the magic of life. But she has a 12-degree out-of-sign conjunction, which I would say is definitely still operative. Second example. This is the publication date of the first Harry Potter book, published in '97. Here again, we have an 8-degree out-of-sign conjunction, which only gets wider and wider as the series continues. What is Harry Potter about, if not the unlocking of the magic of life? It's not to say that the series doesn't get darker as the Saturn-Pluto opposition of the early 2000s comes in, but on the whole, it's certainly riding the Uranus-Neptune wave. The third point has to do with planetary motion in the natal chart, direct and retrograde. So we often read interpretations of retrograde planets in the birth chart, but we rarely ask, how recently did the planet go retrograde? Is it practically stationed, or is it moving really quickly? And this information about the fluid motion of change of the planet, I find is actually more important than whether it's technically retrograde or direct. And we have to examine the days and weeks surrounding the birth moment to know this. And I think it makes a big difference as to the quality of the energy that comes through. So consider this example, my own birth chart. So when I was born, all the outer planets were retrograde except Saturn, which is actually really not that big a deal because the outer planets are retrograde half the year. We need to remember that rarity equals power. So in this sense, it's actually more exceptional to have an inner planet retrograde in one's chart. But just 5 days before I was born, Saturn was retrograde. But what's important here is not so much whether it's retrograde or direct, as if a switch has been flipped, but the fact that Saturn's stationed and that it's just been sitting there, conjunct Pluto, saturating the zeitgeist with its energy the entire time I was in utero. So some people will think that a 9-degree conjunction is really wide, but we have to bear in mind that Saturn got within 4 degrees of Pluto 6 months earlier, and that it'll make a direct pass over Pluto 5 months later. So really, I'm born at the heart of the Saturn-Pluto conjunction of 81 to 84, even though it's a 9-degree conjunction. Being born at the heart of it, this energy comes through for me in a kind of grounded way that permeates many aspects of my life without always pushing its way to the forefront. Whereas Jessica, who was born at the very beginning of the Uranus-Neptune, channels that energy in a much more frontally directed way. And Harry Potter, we might say, is more like a sunset or a crowning moment, a summation of the Uranus-Neptune wave that came before it. So the point here is to try to see charts in context rather than treating them like these discrete, isolated snapshot moments. We saw earlier how temporal motion is an unbroken continuum and that subdividing it loses the meaning of the whole. So if time doesn't work this way and astrology is a temporal art, astrology really shouldn't work this way either. So now I want to return to a couple more theories of time and to discuss the relevance of death and of ethics. Martin Heidegger thematizes death in his view of time, an appropriately Saturnian theme. And he says that the meaning of temporality is care, where the past, present, and future aren't points on a timeline, but they're more how we are in the world in terms of what matters to us. Time's understood in relation to our existence primarily, and only secondarily as an objective ordering of reality. So in the unique realm of our particular life story, it's mortality that has the final say. Time throws us into a complex narrative, and it's in the nature of time to lead to a story, to our historical existence. We each have a story every day throughout our lives. We make choices and decisions that carry a trail of reactions and consequences, and those choices weigh heavy on us because our life is temporary. From the perspective of this incarnation, we don't choose our birth charts. We just have to deal with it. We're kind of thrown into the deep end of life. We wake up splashing, trying to keep our heads above water, until one day we sink. We're thrown into time, and we're thrown into time in a finite way. So the astrological point that I want to note here is that I don't believe astrology can predict the moment of death. You can hear more on this in Jessica's Stream 1 podcast. And so death points to a dimension of existence that eludes astrology. It's a subjective dimension that has to do with my particular unique life, rather than the universal archetypes. So we'll be focusing on this dimension in just a moment when we discuss further narrative and life story. Emmanuel Levinas extends and modifies Heidegger's critique, and he asks if we can understand time not as a relationship with death, but as a relationship with the other, with other persons. And here he wants to bring out the ethical significance of time, the way that time exposes us to other people, people who we end up caring about, who we end up loving and hating, who can make and break our happiness, and who will end up dying finally. We can't master the game of relationships any more than we can master time. And the point is that in some way, they're the same game. So time is not a linear framework that can be mastered, but it's something that we're always already caught up in and we can't escape. Levinas talks about the deformalization of time, meaning that we need to stop thinking about it as an objective form through which content passes, like in Aristotle and Kant, and think about it more like duration. But deformalization of time also means that time deforms us or transforms us. Levinas himself had zero interest in astrology, and actually his Judaism forbid it. So I love the irony that he uses the myth of Zeus, Jupiter, revolting against Kronos, Saturn, to illustrate how duration takes the place of this formalized time. He says that Jupiterian time is a liquid movement of becoming, something that destabilizes the permanence of objects and the subject. We might think more of Neptune in this regard, but Jupiter as the ancient ruler of Pisces fits in nicely. So this Jupiterian time, it can't be synchronized. Synchronic, Kronos, Saturn. It can't be synchronized into these discrete, isolated moments. Time can't be explained by some God's eye point of view either. Rather, it's the movement of time itself that is its essential feature. So time throws us into this world of relationships with other people and things that we didn't ask for and that we can never fully control. It exposes us, makes us vulnerable. And everyone else is in the same boat. This is the ethical significance of time. How do I act? How do I react? How do I make sense of this onslaught of experience and events that I encounter? Who am I? How did I get here? What do I do? Time bewilders us. So, who am I? So basic, so complex. Just like time, we take it for granted until we slow down and think about it. Who am I? Am I my birth chart? In one sense, yes. And this is one of the stunning miracles of astrology, that it reveals elements of our personality and of our psyche and reflects them back to us. But in everyday life, when someone asks us who we are, we tend to respond with a narrative, with a story. Well, I'm the middle child of 3 boys, and when I was 10 years old, we moved from the seedy area of New York City to a white picket fence suburb in Massachusetts. So narratives, they require time. And while transits provide some information about the timing of life events, they're never going to tell me how I will respond to those transits. It'll never tell me what choices I'll make in critical situations, especially ethical ones. They never indicate my decisions in the face of adversity. The chart will never indicate moral character because moral character is something I develop. Moral decisions have this tendency to build upon one another through a lifetime and throughout our existence. So in this way, identity itself is fundamentally narrative because we exist in time. This temporal and historical identity is the story of our life, having to do with where we've been, where we're going. Narrative identity ultimately is an attempt to mediate between sameness and difference, to bring harmony to all the varied events over time through the use of something like plot or story. Each moment we're the same, and yet each moment we're changing, and more over time. How do we string together these different moments into a coherent whole? We tell a story. I'm the middle child of 3 boys, and when I was 10, we moved from gritty NYC to shiny Massachusetts. So when I try to transform who I am I'm trying to change the narrative that I am. So we describe what's happened, we narrate what's happening, and we prescribe what we'd like to see happen. We tell ourselves a story. Each moment of this triad implies a specific relation between constitution of action, how we act in the world, and the constitution of self. Story can provide a bridge between the visceral reality of our lived contact with the world and the more sterile abstractions of our mind. It provides a bridge between concrete experience and intellectual theorizing. This is why novels can teach us something important about life. They provide an as-if experience that gives flesh and blood to abstract concepts and to moral rules. It's one thing to say, you should practice the golden rule, and it's something else altogether when we see Scout's character develop into Kill a Mockingbird. At first, she makes fun of Boo Radley, kind of takes in the story of the townspeople that he's this weird, dark man that shuts himself up inside his house. But then through his little kindnesses, the gifts in the tree, the blanket he puts on her shoulder, eventually even saving her life, she comes to see him as a person. She respects him, defends him from punishment. She rewrites the narrative. So reading this in a story dramatizes it in a much more compelling way than do the bare words, do unto others. Narratives mediate between the universal and the particular, between general rules and their enactments, because applying a rule can shake out really differently in particular contexts, and every rule has an exception. So astrologically speaking, I want to say that archetypes are like the general rule, while interpretation, or narrative, gives them flesh and blood within the particular story of a human life. So general rule and particular story are two equal players. Most of the time, it seems like we give priority to the archetype, as if the combination could be interpreted in a vacuum and tell us everything. But we exist in time, and we make choices whose consequences leave their traces on us. So we have to understand the individual story to interpret the archetype within it appropriately. Giving an interpretation without considering the unique history of the person is kind of like what Thoreau says about a bare fact. He says, "A fact stated barely is dry. It must be the vehicle of some humanity in order to interest us. It's like giving a man a stone when he asks you for bread. Ultimately, the moral is all in all, and we do not mind it if inferior truth is sacrificed to superior, as when the moralist fables and makes animals speak and act like men. It must be warm, moist, incarnated, have been breathed on at least. A man has not seen a thing who has not felt it." And while the gendered pronouns are problematic, I take Thoreau's point. So narrative interpretation mediates between the universal archetype and the particular life story on a vertical axis, and it mediates between past, present, and future in the thick sense of duration on a horizontal axis. We can't take a top-down approach to interpretation as if the archetype dictates everything. We can't pronounce, when this Saturn transit happens, this bad thing X will happen to you. And I feel like I hear astrologers saying these kind of things all the time. In a given moment, it's not just the chart and transits that contribute to what might unfold, but all the thick historical existence that's informing that moment. The events and details of one's past, the projects of one's future. And additionally, I would even say past transits and future ones. How we've dealt with Saturn transits in the past will inform how Saturn transits manifest for us in the present. So to be a good astrological counselor to ourselves or to others, we really need to know the life story that's involved. And then we have to help weave that story forward in light of the energies that are contributing to its transformation. So it's not just about the universal essence reflected by the archetypes, but also the historical existence in time. If time were just the moving image of eternity, then the archetypes would point towards the true essence of things, and existence and time would just be derivative, reflecting that heavenly dance. If time were just a degradation of eternity, it wouldn't give us anything new, but just a recap of eternity in slow motion. But when we give time its due as duration, and we see how we're participating in the co-authorship of our life story, then reality is shaped by the intersection of these two planes, a universal plane of archetypes, the essence, and the particular historical choices of embodied beings, existence. So the intersection of these two planes brings us back, circles back to our original question about how subjective free will interacts with the objective framework of the planets. We've come some way in answering how we marry these two components and how they interact. So before we conclude, let's consider one last thinker of time, this time an astrologer, our first. And this will allow us to recap some of our main points and to wrap things up. So Geoffrey Cornelius makes some pretty radical claims in his book, The Moment of Astrology. He discusses this famous Jung quote that I'll bring up. Whatever is born or done in this moment of time has the quality of this moment in time. Seems pretty straightforward. But by now, maybe we can see that this sounds a lot like the snapshot view of time that we associated with Aristotle, with these discrete, isolatable moments. What's happening down here has the quality of what's going on up there. So Cornelius points out what should be clear to us by now, that if we take this objective time for granted as the whole story, we're going to repress a whole domain of experience, the subjective free will of duration, the particular life story of the person, and the role that the individual plays in weaving their story forward with the archetypes. So Cornelius objects to any notion of a clockwork astrology, a destiny machine, and his basic counterexample is divination. So an omen is understood to be significant for someone who perceives it as significant. It's not like tea leaves are constantly crying out with meaning, but it's only when we direct our focus to them that something emerges. Whereas astrology is generally assumed to be operative whether we're paying attention or not. In divinatory practice, like the Tarot, for example, the fact that we're paying attention and that we're participating is what allows the universe to meet us halfway and to convey some sort of meaningful message. So I'm suggesting we should really slow down and think about the difference between astrology and Tarot here and wonder what the mechanisms are that are at work. Cornelius gives this great example that he calls the anti-astrology signature. It comes from an article that was published by some scientists who were trying to disprove astrology. And the scientists level all sorts of claims against astrology in the article. And at one point, they include some random natal chart as an example. I won't go into all the details, but Cornelius interprets this random natal chart and makes a really compelling case that the chart itself bears an anti-astrology signature. His argument is kind of complex, but we can imagine that the chart contains Saturn-Uranus, for example, negation, Saturn, of astrology, Uranus, and a ton of other similar characteristics, as if the chart were the perfect reflection of the intention of the article. Now, if this random natal chart actually corresponds to the content of the article, how that happens can't be in the manner that the Jung quote suggests. The quality of the moment that the natal chart came about decades earlier is not the quality of the moment when the article was written or published. Instead, there's something divinatory happening. It's as if the authors pulled a tarot card, and that tarot card, the random natal chart, reflected their intentions back to them. So this really brings out the subjective and participatory dimension that we sometimes overlook in astrology. For me, this points out the importance of the tarot or some other divinatory method to supplement astrology, to clarify what mechanisms are at work. Now, of course, if we take this subjective dimension too far, we risk ending up back in the self-enclosed bubble of Kant, where everything is a narcissistic reflection of myself. And this is a real danger, to read whatever signs we would like to see in everything. Rather, we're going for something in between. We're going for an intersubjectivity between us and the cosmos. An overly objective time, the destiny machine of a clockwork astrology, it turns the world into a kind of third-person it, while an overly subjective time makes all the world into the first-person me. So instead, intersubjective time can treat the world as a second person, you, as a thou. So neither a clock-like thing nor a narcissistic projection, but a sentient cosmic intelligence that I can interact and commune with. My participation can meet the world halfway. But what's more, it's not just about the I-thou relationship between the cosmos and my psyche, but it's also about the I-thou relationship between me and all the others in the world. Persons, life forms, things, space beings. And this points to the importance of synastry as the fourth form of correspondence. My natal chart was my mother's transits at the moment of my birth. My mother will live with those transits for the rest of her life in the form of her child, me. And I, likewise, with her chart, with my siblings' charts, with my partner's chart. The part that we play in all these interactions are written into our unique and particular existential history. Time leads to a narrative because our thrownness into history demands that we respond. This is our responsibility in the double sense. It's demanded that we respond to others and that we take responsibility. Not because it's the truth, but because it's a place to stand. It's a way of living authentically with the many I-thou relationships that we wake up into. Responsibility is traumatic. It marks us forever. And our growth is a response to its friction. Time transforms us. Time, we could even say, has the significance of trauma. We don't experience trauma and suffering because we did something wrong. It's in the very nature of time itself. Trauma, in some sense, is written into the fabric of the cosmos. There's something traumatic about time itself. And we say that not to be hard on ourselves, but instead to remind us to be gentle with ourselves in all that we endure. So this should make us think twice about suffering. So many traditions try to explain away evil and suffering, and they always seem to come up short. Christianity says that evil is just an absence of the good. The Buddhists seem to get a step closer by accepting suffering as the way of things, but they still prescribe an escape. I believe that we need to accept it in some way, that part of the reason that we chose to be here is for our suffering. It provides growth and learning, gives our souls depth and compassion. It doesn't mean that we should be masochists, but it does invite us to appreciate the courage of our soul to incarnate in this place of suffering, to do these things, not because they're easy, but because they're hard. So to close, I want to note how this view of time as duration, a time where the past, present, and future are co-implicated with one another, has a feminist angle to it. Instead of individual, atomized, sovereign, heroic moments that are all independent from one another, duration sees time as inherently relational. We can't make sense of the present without seeing it in the context of its relationships to the past and future. So this relates to the revisioning of karma that Jessica talked about last month with respect to Chris Bache's work. When we see our karma as individual and isolated from everyone else's, we lose sight of the work that we're doing as a whole species. My suffering isn't just mine alone. It's not just a result of my individual soul's past actions. It's also something that I take on for the species. our souls really aren't any more isolated than moments in time are isolated. And the work that we do in this lifetime, by taking responsibility and working through the pain we've been dealt, helps to heal and transform the whole species. So in a minute, I'd like to open the floor for questions. Please just take a moment to ground yourself, formulate whatever comments or questions you might have. There's a number of us here, so if you can keep it to under a minute or so. So let's all just take a few deep breaths, and when we're ready, we'll open the floor.
Thank you so much, Travis, for that beautifully articulate and heartfelt talk. It was a wonderful journey, at least for me to go on. So, as Travis said, we're opening the floor now. We really always love to hear from you. So, whether that's a question you have, whether that's something that was evoked for you, a mood, a feeling, a reverie, we would love for you to share, to bring your voice into this circle. Okay, let's see if we can do this here. Let's go to B. Claire. All right. B. Claire, you're unmuted. Go ahead.
I unmuted myself at the bottom of my screen. Can you hear me? Well, that was a lot to take in from Travis. I had to get to hear him personally and meet him in a way. And I'm very interested in philosophy as well as archetypal astrology. So it was a lot to grok, and I'm going to be looking at it again on YouTube or wherever I'm going to be able to see video of it. But it made me weep at the end, and I don't really know why. I guess it was about suffering, which is, I know, universal, and it made it seem like my suffering might be important, not just for me, but for the world or for the people that I meet, or somehow have meaning beyond my little self. And that's important to me because I haven't really done anything in my life that seems like it is meaningful, but perhaps, me and anybody's life is meaningful if looked at in this certain way. So thank you, Travis, and thank you, Jessica. I love you, and I'm so glad that I'm participating.
Thank you so much for sharing. I'm glad that that touched you. I agree. I think that our suffering does have meaning beyond ourselves. And I think it's been really healing for me to feel into that and to feel that I'm not isolated and I'm not doing this just for myself. And especially some of the feelings of guilt or fear that can come up around, did I do something wrong? Am I paying for past mistakes in some way? And I think when we zoom out and we see these deeper interconnections that connect us one to the other and to our species as a whole, we start to realize that some of us who are in the deepest suffering are doing the deepest work for the rest, are doing the deepest work for our species and helping it to unload the backlog that we have. Our species has inflicted great pain, and our species is continually in deep states of suffering. And it's only by realizing the ways that we're all in this together that we will be able to move forward. So I'm glad that that was able to connect for you. Thank you.
So now we're going to go to Fagan.
Hi.
Fagan, go ahead. You're unmuted.
You can hear me?
Yes.
Woo! That was a big one. That was a lot of information, and like I'm really feeling it on a visceral level. I guess I should, well, hello. um, I'm looking at this through the lens of how I identify as an artist educator with the background specifically around this with music and martial arts. So from a musical perspective, I really appreciated how you brought in music, talking about duration. And it makes me think about intersubjectivity as a composer or a songwriter, trying to take something from the ether and put it into form, and how time is something you dance with for me, but how it's, if you have something that's an idea that you want to live beyond you, and if you don't have the ability to record it with this kind of technology where you just press play, but you have to record it in a way that other people can interpret, I find that there's more fluidity in that, but then there's also something being lost in trying to break it down, like specifically in like timing of notes, or how you decide to say where the break is, or where the like if it's a dotted half note, or versus if you want to show it as a voice. Like, I don't know if you can understand, but
Yes.
the complexity of that intersubjective relationship, and how on one level there needs to be something concrete, something Saturnian about it, but where that fluidity comes in is that subjective element as well. So that's the one piece. The other piece is, and I think this is having to do with transpersonal into the personal realm, and vice versa. With movement or martial arts, you're channeling that transpersonal energy. It feels like that, as a channeling, a visceral channeling of that transpersonal into the flesh. And being in flow is intersubjectivity, where the body is an open kind of conduit, and it's like a conjunction. I'm not too savvy with the language here, but these kind of dual contexts of taking something from one level to another, from transpersonal to personal, or what I would call ethereal to like physical, and the play between that, and how that is conveyed as well as interpreted. So I just wanted to bring that to the table and hear your thoughts.
Thank you so much for sharing, Fagan. That's so rich. Where should I start? Well, I'll start with the music. That's more familiar to me. It's really a rich topic that you're bringing out. So, on the one hand, we might think that yes, written down music, because it will be interpreted every time it's read, it leads to a kind of infinite number of variations. Every time that someone plays Bach's Well-Tempered Clavier, it's a different version of Bach's Well-Tempered Clavier. And that's generative and rich on the one hand. You're also bringing out the way that if Bach had a very specific intention about how he wanted that to be played, it's definitely been lost on us, because at the time that he wrote it, we hadn't even fixed tempo markings, so we don't even know exactly how fast he wanted it played. We hadn't fixed tuning either, so we don't know if the keys that he indicated are really exactly the keys that we're playing it in. So in terms of fidelity to a personal vision, notated music doesn't do the best job. On the other hand, it does create this rich plethora of interpretations. So then when we think about recorded music, we'd say, okay, well, recorded music at least puts it down exactly as I intended it, exactly as I sang it and I played it. But even that's not quite the case, because every time we listen to a recording, we're listening to it in a new context. We're listening to it with new feelings, with new experiences that have happened to us. So if I listen to Bach's Well-Tempered Clavier, the Glenn Gould version today, it's going to hit me differently than it hit me the first time I listened to it years ago. So even recorded music also participates in this series of interpretations. And this is one of the points that I was bringing out, that it's in the nature of time to be iterative, to keep changing what's in it. It's me sitting here, and it's still me in this moment, and yet now in this moment it's a slightly different me that's shaped by what's happened the moment before. And so there's both a kind of tragedy that you're bringing out in this transience, that we can never quite hold on to the moment. We can never quite get the exact interpretation right because it's always slipping by. And yet there's something exciting and new that, even me snapping my fingers over and over, it's the same snap every time. But if you just keep listening to it, it starts to take on a kind of trance-like, enchanting quality. Or maybe it starts to get irritating after a while. Or maybe something else. So kind of sameness and repetition always leads to a generative difference. And I think this is one of the fascinating things about living in a time-directional world. To address your second piece about martial arts, I love what you said there, that channeling in a martial arts way, you're in a flow state that puts you in an intersubjective relationship with the cosmos, with source. I just think it's a beautiful illustration of how we can get in touch in this most visceral way. It's certainly not just in philosophy or in spirituality that we're in touch, but it's in motion, it's in physicality. And I think the more ways that we can see all these different opportunities we have for connecting with source, and not just connecting and becoming a conduit, but really being in an intersubjective conversation, something in which we participate and we meet the world halfway. This is the miracle of communing. So thank you for bringing those out.
Would anybody else like to ask a question or to comment or share? Because obviously there's a lot that I would like to say, but I talk to Travis all the time, so I'm gonna bite my tongue. And Luis, all right, 1 second here. All right, Luis, you are unmuted. Go ahead.
Yeah. Question. I was just really struck by when you're talking about how much of who we are as historical beings is the story and the stories that we tell. And in Journey Space, I get that so loud and clear that it just seems like it's all stories and layers upon layers of stories. So I was just wondering if you could say more about the storytelling in general, but also about why it just seems like it should be so much easier to change the story. They seem so permanent, but they're so malleable. But yet to change a story of who we are just seems to take forever. And I'm exaggerating, obviously, but yeah, if you just speak to that a bit, I'd really appreciate it.
Sure. The first thing that came to me when you were mentioning the stories in Journey Space, I think we can really think about just as we are our stories on a personal level. I think the same applies to the species, and I think that we tap into that sometimes in Journey Space, and that our species as a whole, there's a story of humanity, and we are the accumulated memories and stories of all of us. And this connects to what Bonnie was mentioning earlier about how our suffering and our successes are something that we share as a species and aren't relegated to individual experience. To say a little bit more about changing our stories. So part of what I was trying to bring out with the kind of three-part formula there of describe, narrate, prescribe is the way that we can't change our stories on a dime at the drop of a hat. We can't just wake up and say, I want a new story. And that's we can't just do the prescribed function. We have to take account of what's come before. We need to make the story move forward in a meaningful way. It can't isolate itself from what's come before. It's not an isolated moment, it's part of an unbroken continuum. So I think part of what's going on there is, how do we inflect our story differently? Our stories are so much part of who we are, that we have the compulsion to repeat them. And so it seems like a losing strategy to say, I'm just not going to repeat the story. I'm just going to white knuckle it and do something different. And I think that three-part idea says, no, I am this story and it's happening, but how can I inflect it differently? How can I find some slight change that makes a small step in another direction? Because I think it's not possible to escape our stories, so we have to try to put them in a new context, or find parts of the context that we've overlooked, find resources in our past that we haven't noticed that allow us to tell the story differently, to find a new ending. And it's not easy work. It's really not easy work, but it's something that we do day by day. And that by doing over and over, and by being familiar with our story and trying to find different avenues that might be valuable and appealing to us, might allow us to make incremental change. Thank you, Luis.
Okay, we're gonna hear from Rachel now. Rachel, go ahead, you're unmuted.
Hi there. Thank you, Travis. That was amazing. Very interesting. And yeah, triggering lots of different thoughts about the timelines that we open up when we can be present to like where we are on that duration, and what possibly could happen if we just, as you say, respond differently. And then the fact that we can't take ourselves out of the past, even beyond our past, like our ancestors. So we come in a moment of time, we've agreed to arrive in this moment of time, and we're diving into a whole tapestry of stories that are co-running. And some of them are beyond our daily comprehension that they're going on. Because obviously we're in big cycles of time, as well as these micro cycles of time. So time is a super interesting topic. And yeah, I think that perhaps our suffering is because we don't have control of time. And we can't do our time again. And things that happen are kind of set into the fabric of time. And that we will run out of time at some point, because we come in for a prescribed period of time. But then we have a legacy of time that we don't comprehend, because we can't understand the vastness of time. So yeah, what a fabulous presentation. Super interesting. And I love the way that you correlated it with the feminine and masculine, because I see that too, that there's this wave of time where we're all connected like water, and you can't really separate anything. And then this other view where you could like snapshot it, which doesn't feel right. And so suffering, I think, is this resistance to accepting the story that we agreed to come in on, and then not having the tools and awareness to see how we can pick up that hand, that deck, and run with it in a different way. Try to innovate something, to do something slightly different.
Thank you, Rachel. Yeah, I like what you're bringing out here about this other way of thinking about timelines that we hear sometime, of trying to get on different timelines. Matthew Stelzner's really opened me up to this way of thinking about it, and I think it's rich. I think there are there are multiple paths for us, and there are ways that we can participate in finding those optimal timelines, those ones that where we really fulfill our destiny in a deep and rich way. But yes, I'm a believer, as you said, of we can't just resist our suffering. I think even on the optimal timeline, when we fulfill our destiny in the deepest possible way, that isn't by eliminating all suffering. And I think it would be a mistake to think that that is the best version of our story. I think that our ego would like that quite a bit, but it seems like our soul has deeper intentions for ourself. And so finding this kind of delicate balance between saying I want to live a rich, happy life that I'm okay with, but also accepting some necessary aspects of suffering that come along with incarnating in the earth realm. How do we find that balance, and can we tune into our deepest self to know what that is? Because it's really hard to know with our egos or our minds alone. Thank you.
So we still have time for one, maybe two more. While you're all pondering on whether or not you're going to raise your hand, would it be okay if I said a couple of things in response to what you've been saying, Travis? Because I want to reflect some things back, and then I want to ask a question or two. Okay. So I just want to reflect back a couple of things that you said that really struck me. I think that as you're talking about these layers of time, your talk was extremely layered, and there were moments where like I dropped down in for a while and found myself like I've never really done ketamine, but like what they call a K-hole, where it's like you're going along and then you just drop into like, essentially it's like infinity or eternity, and then I popped back out again and I was like, oh, where am I? Anyways, it's neither here nor there. All right, so what I really loved what you said was you said astrology is a temporal art. And along with that, you also said that astrology never tells us how we respond. It doesn't indicate moral character. And I think this is something that really is in the ontological part of astrology, which is, and this is something I think most astrologers miss, or I shouldn't say that, a lot of astrologers miss, which is the chart never tells you how you're going to respond to your chart. It never tells you how you're going to respond to life events. It can tell you about tendencies on a spectrum that we sometimes call as light and shadow, but it never tells you exactly in real time when the rubber hits the road how you're going to respond to life. And I think that is extremely crucial. And with that, you said that, really identity is fundamentally narrative, that who I am is a narrative. And it's a narrative that not only do I tell myself, but the people around me tell me who I am. And that intersubjectivity of negotiating the difference between who I think I am and who the people around me, family, friends, whomever, think that I am. And how much of my time as an empath is spent in trying to discern and dismantle the difference between those two, where they overlap and where they feel totally incoherent. And do they feel incoherent because I'm misperceiving and I'm in denial? Or are they incoherent because the other person is projecting onto me? Or is it some mix of both? And that's kind of where I start to get into my psychotic core and that messiness of trying to discern between that intersubjectivity of me and all the other me's, while the universe seems to be holding this like larger frame of mirroring me back to myself through my chart and transits. And lastly, and this is really what I want to hear more from you on is, what you're talking about today is a philosophy of astrology, and what I do is counseling astrology, and we need each other. We need each other in order to have a more well-rounded, balanced metaphysics. I need you in your philosophical pursuits of understanding the underpinnings of the workings of everything that's happening. And you need me and you need us counseling astrologers for the clinical embodied practice of what does this really look like when we show up with a client, we're doing interpretation. And this is the part that I want to hear from you is you're talking about here in part the role of the person who's doing the interpreting or who's doing the divining, that we can't just read Saturn as a transit and say this is what this means, that actually there is no such thing as XYZ. That's not how it works. But yet astrology doesn't ever seem to want to talk about that part. They don't want to talk about the role of the interpreter as a channel in their own subjectivity, coming in with the subjectivity and therefore the intersubjectivity with the other person. They only want to talk about the meaning as if there is such a thing as one meaning or a set or prescribed meaning. And I'm just wondering, do you have any thoughts on that? Or like what's going on there? Like why is that happening? Either, why does that happen like that? How is it that we're using this tool that's supposed to show us about ourselves and self-knowledge, yet as an astrologer, we're rarely asked to look at ourselves and how we're making meaning of what's going on? It just seems like one of our biggest blind spots, and I'm so confused and frustrated as an astrologer. Like, why is that happening? Or what, I don't know. So anything I just said, I'm all riled up over here. So I'm going to stop talking now. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jessica. Thank you, that was very rich. The first thing that comes to mind is I think there's, what you were saying kind of, I think maybe there's even an analogy that we could make between something you just pointed out and something I was talking about. I was drawing this polarity out between the archetypal essence and the particular life story. And in a way, the relationship between the philosopher of astrology and the counseling astrology kind of falls along those same lines. That the philosopher of astrology, as much as I tried to give a good embodied talk, this is a bit rarefied. When we're talking about metaphysics, it has to be abstract in some way. And that's a sort of universal God's eye point of view in a way, in contrast to the way that the counseling astrologer is on the ground with real people with particular life stories. And that these two things need each other. And that to give a top-down approach from the philosophy of astrology perspective would be wrong in the same way as giving a top-down approach from the archetypal essence perspective. It's the first thought that comes to mind. So why? Why do people want to ignore this subjective element? I think one reason is because so much of an astrologer's power comes from being able to say, Saturn means this, Jupiter means this. When you start to bring that into a more relative and subjective frame, the astrologer loses their power. And I think that's at work in a lot of cases, even if folks don't want to admit it. It knocks astrology down a peg. Instead of it pronouncing upon the architecture of the universe, it's just one more discipline to try to get in touch with our story and our pain and our aspirations. I think sometimes astrologers too, I think especially in our day and age, there's a reaction to scientism. People are so concerned with defending astrology against some of its naysayers that they have a tendency to focus more on the objective meanings. No, this means that, and astrology is almost like a science. Astrology is not a science. I mean, maybe it's a sacred science if you want to give it a different kind of definition, but astrology will never be something like physics, chemistry, or biology. And Geoffrey Cornelius makes this abundantly clear in his book. He goes through, for so many decades, people tried to do statistical studies of astrology and they all failed miserably. And there's good reasons why we should not want astrology to be like that. I mean, and one of the best, I think, is that it ends up leading to a certain fatalism. If astrology really worked that way, there wouldn't be much room left for free will. And I think in that same vein, I think in our particular moment, in our particular era, we're out of touch with the flesh and blood of particular life stories. And we want easy answers. We want to be told it's going to be okay when Jupiter transits such and such. And we don't want to be told it's only going to be okay if you really show up and do the hard work. Those are some thoughts that come to mind. I think there's lots of things that can be said on that question, and I think it's a pivotal question for our time. And I invite us all to continue to reflect on it.
Thank you so much, Travis. I think we'll have to do a podcast soon on it all. So we have two people with their hand raised. I see that we're at time. I see that Rachel raised her hand in response to what was just happening. So Travis, it's up to you. I can call on Rachel to have her response to that, and then we'll end with Bill.
Sure, go ahead.
Okay, all right. Rachel, you're unmuted.
Yeah, I think that is the beauty, because obviously you can have a reading with different people and you will have a different interpretation, because that is the nature of astrology. And that's why archetypal astrology is so intriguing, because of course we're talking about themes, and so there's lots of different ways of coming in and seeing that, and I think that's the beauty of it. And in relating to science, I would say astrology really connects with that whole quantum physics thing where the observer influences the result and stuff like that. So what is science anyway? We've had that reductionist science stuff, which is like taking the snapshot of time, but astrology is maybe a higher science because it appreciates that you can't. Everything is so interconnected. So I think that's the beauty. It's not the failing of astrology, it's the beauty of it, is that we can bring ourselves to it and filter it through different ways of seeing, which is why astrology has transformed so much, because it used to be so fatalistic and depressing when we identified things as being negative planets or having negative positions and stuff like that. Whereas now we don't talk about them like that. So we're evolving astrology. And that's beautiful. And science has to evolve too. So I think that's what my response to that last bit was, that that's a good thing about it.
That's just great, Rachel. Yeah, I think in that sense, we can see astrology and science as friends and not as enemies. Our science is going to places that we never believed, and thank goodness that our astrology is evolving in step. And if anything, yes, they're becoming more friendly than they once were. Let's hear from Bill before we wrap up.
Hi, Travis.
Hi, Bill. Good to see you.
That was great. Just a few minutes ago, you mentioned suffering, our deepest self, and balance all in one sentence. And I was thinking about it, and what it reminded me of is this idea that perhaps when we're suffering, when we're in a suffering space, if we can maintain contact with our deepest self in some way, that deepest self which is not constrained by clock time the way our egoic mind is, if we can maintain that contact, we can see the light at the end of the tunnel of the suffering. And the suffering doesn't go away, but being able to see the light at the end of the tunnel can really be helpful before we come to another suffering space. I just wondered what you thought about that.
Yeah, I think too often we feel alone, we assume we're alone, but I think it's important to ask for help, to see yourself surrounded by helpers and guides, as Chris Bache likes to say, that our higher selves, our angels, our guardians, they're there and they want to help us. And if we turn inward and we ask for help, I think we'll get it. And I think that gives us hope and helps us to remember that we're not in this alone. There's higher beings helping us, and we're not in it alone. We're all here together as a species. So I do see that light at the end of the tunnel, and I got my fingers crossed, even though it's dark times. Whew. Saturn, Pluto. Thank you all so much for coming today. It's so great to see all your faces. I loved interacting with you, and I can't wait to do it again next month, July 7th. Tune in, and until then, wishing you all blessings. I'm going to leave you with a little song I recorded for you. So please enjoy. This magic moment, so different and so new, was like any other until I kissed you, and then it happened. It took me by surprise. I knew that you felt it too, by the look in your eyes. Sweeter than wine, softer than a summer's night. Everything I want I have whenever I hold you tight. This magic moment, when your lips are close to mine, will last forever. Oh, forever till the end of time. Whoa, 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 whoa. Sweeter than wine, softer than a summer's night. Everything I want I have whenever I hold you tight. This magic moment, when your lips are close to mine, will last forever. Oh, forever till the end of time. Whoa, 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 whoa. Whoa.